Good evening and welcome to another daily devotion as we read through the Bible in a year. And here is the devotion for June 22nd, which is today as I'm recording this. So we're going to look at 2 Kings chapter 3 verse 1 through 4:17, especially chapter 4 verses 1 through 7, the story of the widow's oil. In this section of 2 Kings, we have some stories about Elisha that follow up on the stories that we read about Elijah, his predecessor. And these episodes in Elisha's life show that he was a worthy successor to Elijah. And Elisha continued on in his ministry in a similar manner. However, the main purpose of these narrative accounts of Elisha show that he and ultimately God himself cared about and provided for God's people, those who had faith. Amid everyday life, we see miracles taking place. The story of the widow's oil shows that Elisha was deeply concerned with a moral and a societal problem that was very serious: the enslavement of defaulting debtors or their families was common throughout the ancient Near East. So, in verse 1 of chapter 4, we see that the wife of one of the sons of the prophets, who were kind of like prophets in training, tells Elisha that after her husband's death, the creditor is coming to take her children as slaves because she couldn't pay her debt. It's a little hard to tell, but as the wife calls Elisha your servant, that was simply a polite way of greeting him. In the next two verses, Elisha has the woman, so to speak, take inventory of her meager belongings, and all she has is a jar or pot of oil, maybe something like a small anointing flask. So it is that relief often begins with the little that we already have on hand. And Elisha's words are encouragement for the woman to have faith in God. And she is given the job of going around and borrowing all the containers that she can from all of her neighbors, only she has to be careful not to gather up too few containers. So, in the next verse, verse 4, Elisha has the woman seek out the privacy of a shut door, and behind the shut door she is to pour the oil from her jar into the containers that she has gathered up. This privacy highlights God's working seemingly in secret, but nevertheless in a very personal and powerful way. And this miracle is like the miracle performed by Elijah for the widow of Zarephath. If you remember that, as she fed Elijah and herself and her son, her little bit of oil and her handful of flour never ran out for all the days until the drought and famine were over. Then, in our story, in the next 3 verses, all the way to the end of our little section, we see that the widow keeps pouring and pouring and pouring oil into the jars brought to her by her 2 sons. This is reminiscent also as we think about Jesus' first miracle or sign at the wedding in Cana, when the servants were told by Jesus and then Mary to fill the jars with water. So, in our story, in Elisha's life, now we see the widow pouring the oil until she was out of containers. And there was enough oil so that Elisha could tell her to sell what was required to pay the debt, and then she could provide for herself and her sons with the leftover amount. Basic common sense. And that's important too, to be sure. But most of all, God provides abundantly, even when it seems like our resources are limited. Here, we also can think of the feeding of the 5,000 and how they gathered 12 basketfuls of leftover bread and fish. God promises in Deuteronomy to provide justice, food, love, clothing for the fatherless and the widow and the sojourner. So we also draw comfort and strength from passages such as Ephesians 3:20, which says, "Now to him who is able to do far more abundantly than all we ask or think, according to the power at work within us." And we also share God's concern for those in desperate need, as it says in James 1:27, religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their affliction and to keep oneself unstained from the world. So, quite an episode in the life of Elisha. May God be with you and bless you, and I'll look forward to talking with you again real soon.